And they're basically trying to fight to the death. I've been fighting them for a decade. You know, I hoped that there might be a private sector kind of solution to this. I know my libertarian friends think that there should be a private sector solution to this, you know, because they have this unlimited faith that the private sector is always better than government regulation. But you know, what I have discovered in this, you know, the founders were the original libertarians, and they certainly believed in that government governs best which governs least. But even they understood that there was a need for government to provide for national security and homeland defense, because you can't do that in the private sector. The merchant, when he has that dollar in his hand, and he thinks, well, am I going to spend this on protecting the electric grid against a 1 in 100-year geomagnetic superstorm, or against the possibility of a terrorist or Iranian nuclear attack? We'll always put it in his pocket. Why? Because he'll say, well, that's the responsibility of the government. And he's right. It is the responsibility of the government. And it's the responsibility of the government to regulate the private sector and to compel them to pass regulations to harden the grid so it's not vulnerable to EMP. You know, we do this with every other sector of the private sector, every other critical infrastructure. For example, we have a Federal Aviation Administration, all right, that regulates the airline industries. Because we learned we can't trust the airline industries when it comes to assessing why did an airplane crash, all right? In the past, it was always pilot error. Or before there was an FAA, you know, we had this thing in the 1920s and 30s called the Zeppelin, or the Zeppelin industry, and no federal regulation of it. And the Zeppelin industry convinced itself that traveling by hydrogen balloon could be made safe, you know, because their operational procedures would be so good that there would never be a Hindenburg. And they were wrong, and they even put themselves out of business, okay? You know, but had there been a Federal Aviation Administration that forced them to use helium, there might still be Zeppelins with us, in addition to jet airliners and the rest. You know, we have an FAA because when an airplane crashes, hundreds of people's lives are going to be lost. And so we want to make sure that, you know, that when a plane crashes, an independent, objective body like the FAA does the analysis as to why that plane crashed. And then they have the authority to compel the airlines to make whatever fixes need to be done so the crash doesn't happen again. That's not the situation with the same thing with the pure food and drug industry. You know, there was a time when there was cocaine put into Coca-Cola, and films would show up in cans of peaches. You know, we needed a few pure food and drug administration to fix that. Automobiles today have safety glass and airbags and seat belts and bumpers that can withstand collisions 5 miles an hour, not because of the industry. They were forced by the Department of Transportation to do all those things. Right now, the electric power industry is the last critical infrastructure that basically regulates itself. And they will never, if left to their own devices, no matter how you incent it. I'll give you an example I can be told now because, you know, Jerry Cawley is no longer the chairman of the NERC. But I and Frank Gaffney, after a London summit on EMP, we got together. Jerry Cawley had been there. He was the chairman and CEO, president of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And I asked him, we had a private meeting, and I asked Jerry, I said, look, you know, the EMP Commission estimates it would cost about $2 billion to protect the grid. What if the Department of Defense pays for it? What if DOD puts up all the money and pays for it so it doesn't cost your industry a penny? Would you do it? And he said no. And the reason isn't because it's the money. They don't want to lose their independence in terms of having federal inspectors, because people would have to come in, experts from the Department of Defense who know about EMP and understand it, to inspect the work, to make sure that the work is good, to make sure that the defenses are maintained and upgraded. And they wouldn't even if we paid for it, they wouldn't want that regulatory intrusion on their industry. So in my experience, you know, this model that we're going to incentivize the industry, you know, they're the biggest part of the problem. You know, they have to be compelled to protect the grid at the end of the day. And, you know, by passing and the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission won't do it. They're in the top pocket. They belong with the electric power industry. All the guys on the FERC, you know, which is supposed to be the agency that provides the security of the grid are former lobbyists and lawyers that work for the electric power industry. And political scientists call it regulatory capture. You know, we need a new executive level EMP, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection czar, somebody at the White House level, as you're the president, that can knock the heads together of all the agencies and departments and make this thing happen. Make the DoD cooperate with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy and put the protections in place, you know, in the electric power grid. You know, basically the same way we provide for public safety and national security and all the other critical infrastructures. And that's what's going to have to happen. You know, we have tried the incentive route, and it hasn't worked for a decade. I don't know if Hank wants to add to that.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Peter has to say. We may disagree on a couple of things. I've already pointed out to you that at least I have serious hope that the Duke Energy folk are taking this seriously. And I know they are taking it seriously enough to spend a fair amount of their own money, not only on what they're doing to protect their portion of the grid, but also with universities in the southeastern part of the United States to improve the resiliency of the grid rather than just passing out money to professors and others that are funding particular research that they review to deal primarily with cyber at this point as a threat. But as Peter will tell you, and actually mentioned, the EMP threat is actually part of the cyber threat and doctrine of our enemies, whether it be Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So if we deal with cyber correctly, we will deal with the EMP threat. About 25 years ago, there was a commission called the Marsh Commission. It was instituted in the 1990s. And one of the principal outcomes in looking at critical infrastructure at that time was their concern about cyber threats. And one of the reasons we're taking it as seriously as we are today, you can trace to the operations of that particular commission, which was established by presidential executive order, operating with a full-time paid chairman at the time, not one working pro bono, which is what I think Bill Graham has done for 17 years on the EMP Commission, and commissioners and other support and so on working this issue and reporting to the president. I think that's what we need today, maybe with additional work. See, I don't believe it's money, and I think that's what Peter just said as well. I think the regulatory operation is corrupt. I agree with him on that. I call it a self-licking ice cream cone. You know, the energy companies and others look out for their own. And unfortunately, the DoD has withheld from the private sector what we learned over the last century of how to deal with this with the critical infrastructure. And the Department of Defense doesn't judge that the private sector's infrastructure is part of their job. Admiral Courtney, when he was the commander of Northcom out in Colorado Springs, made that explicitly clear. He basically said, you know, we try to help DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI in dealing with terrorists and so on, but it's not really part of my job. At the same time, he was spending $1 billion, the better part of it, to harden equipment from Peterson Air Force Base and move it back into Cheyenne Mountain to deal with the EMP threat. So it's not that we're ignorant. It's the fact that government is dysfunctional, absolutely dysfunctional, and it's worse than ignorance. I mean, I think they're corrupt. And until we get a serious involvement from the White House and from the President, the only hope I have is to get the private sector engaged in a serious way. And let me expand a little bit on the difficulty of this problem. I said Duke is really engaged in working the problem. I'm working this issue in York County in South Carolina. Duke sells electricity to at least one, I think, two co-ops and a utility company that provide the electricity to citizens of South Carolina. So if Duke Energy does its job perfectly and takes care of its production and transmission of electricity around its network, that doesn't assure the citizens of York County are going to get electricity until we figure out how to harden the infrastructure of utility companies and co-ops who, this is the heritage of the whole infrastructure of this country, how it grew up over the years from the REA and a lot of other things. There's something like 1,500 of these companies around the United States, and they operate a large portion of the infrastructure which we need to protect to assure the citizens survive. It's a very complex issue. And I think getting leadership within the private sector who knows what they're doing, isn't ashamed to explain what they're doing, and having some authority inside of Washington establishment that will recognize that, will deal with the concern Peter has in mind. But I agree with him. What we have today is really corrupt. The regulatory scheme is broken. One of the reasons I place top priority on working the nuclear power plants because they're a hazard if we don't get it right. And on the other hand, if we do get it right, they become a key source of electricity for the needs of the future after a major blackout. But another reason I want them is because they're regulated by something called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is an outgrowth of the Nuclear Navy. If you know, go all the way back to Rickover, Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the Nuclear Navy. Many of those people who work at the NRC grew up in that heritage. I think they got a bunch of lawyers now in charge, and that worries me. But technically, because the Nuclear Navy, as far as I know, has not had a serious accident with the reactors they have on our ships and our submarines. I have a grandson who's a nuclear officer submarine. So I believe the NRC would do a better job than what we've got now, at least on what where their responsibilities lie. And if we get them engaged in a serious way on this matter, maybe we can get spillover into the nerd further. But it's broken at the moment.
I have a question for clarification. Given the current climate of the political correctness and all this garbage, what oversight is there for organizations that are masquerading as foundations but are actually doing acts that are against and sometimes directly adversarial to the United States? What oversight exists? Can we demand oversight? How do we do that?
That's a serious issue, and you're putting your finger on a very important problem. Many of the organizations, which are Muslim Brotherhood front groups, for example, have 501c3 status. If you know, with the IRS, that is a status that grants them a tax-free status, and they can masquerade as something charitable, or an Islamic center may have a charitable status and yet be a command and control post for jihad. These are things that we've really got to put our minds to, because they haven't been thought of before. The other issue is a number of hard left Marxist communist groups, for example, under the aegis of let's say, an Antifa or a George Soros. And some of those groups are actually receiving U.S. government federal funds in the form of grants for which they apply and are approved. And so all of that needs better oversight, but it's such a humongous problem. Right now there are small and private groups who understand the issue and are looking at it, but there's no organized government oversight of these things aside from granting the 501c3 status. Heaven help you if you've got patriotic in your name or Tea Party in your name. But if it's, RevCom USA, you're good to go. This is something that we really have to look at, yeah.
My next question is for Ambassador Cooper. There is a group of people people in California that are attempting to get a molten salt reactor, something invented by Alan Weinberg back in the 60s that successfully operated without incident or accident for over 10 years. It's revolutionary nuclear energy that does not melt down. It's molten salt based as opposed to a light water reactor. Have you guys heard of it? Is there any effort to get this up and running, especially before China does, because they're trying to do it first?
Direct answer is I'm not really fully acquainted with this. I've heard of it, and I do believe we should be working on that as well as the so-called microgrids, which is one item that I think DOD is investing some resources in, peculiarly because of the screwy way our responsibilities lie in this country. It's really strange they have not taken seriously making sure the public is taken care of and the grid overall is taken care of, since they depend on it. All our bases depend on that. All our operational forces depend on the electric power grid, but it's not part of their job to make sure that that works. On the other hand, if they can build microgrids and put them on the bases, then they can make sure their stuff works. Where the hell did, provide for the common defense go, in all of this? So, I mean, this is what I mean about the government being broken. I want to make one more thing clear since I got the mic here. I've been championing Duke Energy. Make sure you understand. I wouldn't take money from Duke if they tried to give it to me. I'm not a spokesman for Duke. And in fact, for anybody on these matters, I'm doing it for my grandkids because Peter's right. We're dealing with an existential threat. This is not just, some sort of something to get involved in, and I'm not sure how even to describe it otherwise.
I got one for all three, and it's kind of a drain the swamp question, and what's been brought out. Folks here in this auditorium, a few of us, we had a run-up when they wanted to, and then the Senate was going to vote on whether or not to keep the EMP Commission. And there was an excellent paragraph you helped author. The bill has over 1,000 pages, the Armed Services funding bill, but it was well elucidated that keep this because of all the brain power, everything that has been going on for 16, 17 years in Washington. We were involved, we faxed to the Senate Armed Services Committee. We mailed, we emailed, and it was a major effort. Nothing. And our own Senator Joe Donnelly here in this state sits on that committee, and he received tons of explanations on why you don't want to do this. Yet it was abolished. That's a terrible blanchment on government and the Senate and those members. Comments. Please comment, because that really threw us for a loop, because that was a major effort for people.
Well, it threw us for a loop too. And, and this is just another example of how broken Washington is and how corrupt Washington is. The decision, to terminate the commission really came down to, two people. There was a staffer who works for Matt Thornberry, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And Thornberry did not meet with the chairman of our the commission was accused of corruption by Obama holdovers in the Department of Defense. Okay? And we weren't given a chance to defend ourselves. Just like President Trump, basically, hasn't really been given a chance to defend himself, but they just ran with that accusation. To our astonishment, the Republican chairman of the House Armed Services Committee credited that accusation enough to start a Department of Defense investigation. And as soon as a DOD IT starts an investigation, that makes you radioactive. He didn't talk to our chairman. Our chairman is Dr. William Graham, who had been President Reagan's science advisor. He was the director of NASA. He was on the defense science team that discovered the EMP phenomenon. And he spent his whole life trying to protect America and the free world from EMP. This is the Albert Einstein EMP. And Thornberry wouldn't even give him a phone call or answer any of his letters. He sent him a letter again last week. You know, this is what happens when, you know, I understand from, you know, basically the response from Thornberry was, well, I have to trust my staff. No, sir. No, Mr. Thornberry. You don't have to trust your staff. You know, you're there to hear all sides of the story. You should have met with your EMP Commission chairman. You should have at least had a phone call with him and gotten his side of the story, and not listened to your snot-nosed staffer and made a critical decision that affects the future of this country, you know, based on rumors coming from Obama holdovers in the Department of Defense that are completely false. And that's why, that's the story that other people probably heard from the Senate, and why they have to do. Now they're trying to engage in a, well, the original EMP Commission was terminated. By the way, it was terminated on the 30th of September, in the same month that North Korea successfully tested a hydrogen bomb, that the North Koreans described this design for a super powerful EMP attack, and also released a technical report entitled The EMP Might of Nuclear Weapons, which accurately describes super EMP weapons, okay? It was, one of the former congressmen who established the EMP Commission in the first place, Kurt Weldon, who's gone into retirement and has vowed never to get involved in politics, actually got involved in politics as part of that effort and wrote an article for The Hill, the first sentence of which said, only Washington could be so stupid, you know, that they would terminate the EMP Commission at this time with the EMP threat from North Korea when it is most needed. But Washington is that stupid, and it's that broken, you know, and this is what happens when you have, you know, congressional staffers who basically have these positions of power, incredible power, just by accident, not because they've earned it, because they happen to guess right, and they happen to be working for the right guy at the right time, and they land a plum job on a committee, and really have no expertise themselves, but they end up with this tremendous power. They're not elected to it, and then you have the accident of a chairman of a committee, you know, who's not willing to doesn't do his job. And his job should have been to meet with the chairman of our EMP Commission and hear our side of the story. In fact, there shouldn't even have been purpose for such a meeting, you know, because the reason for these charges being brought, you know, was the, you know, the Obama holdovers were trying to destroy the commission from the beginning of its establishment. They delayed our work for a whole year, they held back our funding, they wouldn't give us security clearances. You know, we didn't see a penny out of them until President Trump was elected. See, they were counting on Hillary getting elected, and that they would be able to get away with murdering the commission. But suddenly, when Trump won, suddenly we started seeing money come from them, you know, to support a little bit of the work of the EMP Commission. But, you know, we only had 6 months left, and even though we produced 14 reports in 6 months, you know, because we crashed on an emergency basis, it still wasn't enough. We weren't able to fulfill our mandate. But that's basically why. I mean, it really came down to a handful of, you know, 2 people in the House Armed Services Committee and 1 guy over in the Department of Defense managed to kill the EMP Commission. And none of them, their collective IQ is 1% that of Dr. Bill Bray. This is like, I think that this is like, the irresponsibility of this is so great. You know, people who read history may recall there was something called the Einstein letter. It was written to Franklin Roosevelt, you know, at the outbreak of World War II, where Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, warning him that there was this new technology, this new unprecedented threat called the atomic bomb. And the Nazis were working on it. And America had better not get surprised by this thing. And based on that, you know, Roosevelt launched the Manhattan Project so that we were able to win World War II with the atomic bomb. The equivalent of this is tearing up the Einstein letter and firing Albert Einstein just when the North Koreans are hitting the atomic bomb.
I just want to elaborate what Peter said. You may think that he's exaggerating. He's not exaggerating. Bill wrote not just to Thornberry. He wrote to the Secretary of Defense. He wrote to the Secretary of Energy. I don't know, did he write to the Secretary of Homeland Security? I don't know.
Yeah.
Never got a response from a single one of them. Okay, not a response. Thornberry took the word of this staffer. Now, Thornberry refused Trent Frank's efforts to try to deal with it as a member of this committee, and unfortunately, we lost Trent, so we don't have him there to fight our causes inside. So, I don't know what to say. I mean, Washington is broken. These people, you can say, well, you know, you do have to back up your staffers if you want, but that's a bunch of crap. Maybe I should say stronger words than that. You folks are familiar with foreign words out here. So, you know, Washington is badly broken. And I hope that Trump cares enough about these issues and that it wasn't just someone writing his stuff to put in the speeches and whatever, but to take it seriously. And he's really got to grab it by the throat to deal with it. I mean, it's got to be in the White House, in my judgment, to pull this together. Congress, in canceling the old commission, stood up a new commission, or gave instructions to stand up a new commission, which is nothing but a recipe, in my judgment, for bureaucratic and political infighting for 6 months to a year, while people try to figure out how to replace these people that served for 17 years without compensation because they care about the country and they were experts. Donnie Foster, who was a third-ranking guy in the Pentagon when I was a young buck as a lieutenant, was a bomb designer. I think he may be the last living bomb designer who actually saw his weapon tested. Okay? We haven't run a test in this country since 1992. So, and if any of you are technical people, you're suspicious or skeptical of things that are only based on theory. If you don't test it, I don't believe it. And that's a problem we have overall, and we haven't had serious testing of nuclear weapons now for 25 years. So the country's in bad shape here, and I hope the president cares enough and will listen to enough people around him to deal with this issue. I said I had confidence in a couple of people in OSD. One other I should have mentioned is Guy Roberts, who is the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Matters, and these characters that created the problem are in his office. I mean, that's where the snakes are. And I hope he's got enough courage and wit to take them on. But I have to tell you, at the same time, I've been on telephone calls with Secretary Mattis, and I think he's a skeptic, frankly, or he was then. Maybe he's woken up to the issue since then. And so I worry about just believing in the institution of government in Washington righting itself. They rely on staffers that aren't with us, call it the deep state, Obama holdovers, whatever. We have too many staffers that we could do the world a lot of good if we just fired 2/3 of the people there. Hyman Rickover, I remember a paper he wrote back in the 1960s, I believe it was, and he had a recipe at the time. The Pentagon was the center for practically everything, and he was unhappy with that bureaucracy, and he had a recipe for how to deal with it. He said you just closed off the 5th floor. You don't fire anybody, you don't worry about it. He said, let them all scramble to find another seat. And then when they all get settled in, you close the 4th floor. And he said, by the time you get down to 1 floor, maybe you'll have a lean bunch that will do the job. That's the problem. I mean, Washington has grown by enormous proportions. We have elected and appointed officials who don't do their own writing, don't do their own thinking. They got staffs to do the job. And sometimes some staffers are good. You know, I mean, it's good for the economy, I guess. And I don't think it's good for the economy when so much of it is dependent on government employees. I'm sorry if I offend anybody. But I think we had a time when we had people in the jobs who did the jobs rather than figure out how to get reelected or get the next thing, and they got staff to do their work. I'm sorry to go on, but anyway.
I got prepared today for this by going to Heritage Foundation has had this issue on their radar for a while, and they had just come out with an April 4th backgrounder. And I thought, oh, what a great way to sort of get updated. And I was very, very, disappointed, as they reported, and you have confirmed here, that our country is still at the point of trying to define and unify on a definition of the problem. There's still no prioritization. There's no assignment of responsibilities for the differing things that need to go into addressing the EMP issue. And that's basically what you have said at worst today. I think you have properly defined the deep state as a huge part of the problem. And I guess my question was answered by your response to JD. And I guess the only thing I would do is just salute you, hats off to you. 3 people who are willing to go into the belly of the beast every day and be persistent and have the grit and the determination. And I cannot imagine how, I don't see a positive outcome. I hope you do, and if you do, I'll ask the question, what's the positive outcome to all of this? I'm not seeing it right now, but I have a heartfelt gratitude towards the 3 of you, and I know more, who are willing to take on this seemingly impossible, thank you, task, and to try to make some sense of something that seems to make no sense short of corruption, no love for our country, no understanding of our country, and no historical undergirding of people who are making decisions. And so I'm not going to ask the question unless you do have a positive thing you're looking forward to here.
Well, it's against my nature.
I'd like to say thank you.
But I'll try to look on the bright side, because you know, life and reality has tended to make me the glass is always half empty kind of guy. But there are some possibilities here, some bright spots here. For one thing, we are winning. We are winning, and it's really a miracle. I mean, the people, Hank Cooper, Claire Lopez, the handful of people, you know, Frank Gaffney's organization, Center for Security Policy, my EMP task force, and by the way, even though the EMP Commission has been terminated, we're not going away. You know, my little EMP task force, we've been, you know, having congressional commissions like having an aircraft carrier. But every time the commissions are terminated by their natural life anyway. They only last for 18 months at a time. But every time the commission has gone away, we've come back in this EMP task force that I have, which is just, you know, a little nonprofit. And it's sort of like going from an aircraft carrier onto a torpedo patrol boat. But we are always there. For 17 years there, we've been there. And we're going to continue to be there. As long as we can shoot one cannon or launch one torpedo, we're going to be in the fight. And you know, even though it's a David versus Goliath battle, because the government is an enormous bureaucracy,